For more than 6 decades, Judi Dench lived by words, reading them, shaping them, and turning them into truth on stage and screen. She built a career on precision, a pause held just long enough, a glance sharp enough to silence a room. But now, at an age when most legends are remembered rather than questioned, Dench has spoken with quiet clarity about something far more frightening than retirement. The woman who once commanded entire theaters has admitted she can no longer see well enough to move through the world alone. And with that admission comes a question her audience has never been prepared to face. When the rules were supposed to end. By the early 1990s, Judi Dench had already lived several professional lifetimes. She was revered on the British stage, especially through her work with the Royal Shakespeare Company, where she became synonymous with emotional authority rather than surface glamour. Yet, beyond theater circles, the industry had quietly placed her in a familiar box. She was respected, but no longer expected to surprise. Film and television had little room for women past a certain age, and Dench was moving well beyond the point where most actresses were gently ushered aside. What followed was not a comeback because she had never truly disappeared. It was something far more disruptive. When she stepped into the role of M in the Bond franchise, she did so at an age when women were rarely offered power on screen, let alone dominance. Her M was not decorative, maternal, or symbolic. She was direct, unsentimental, and unafraid to confront Bond himself. In a single decision, Dench dismantled the idea that authority on screen had an expiration date. This late-blooming global recognition was not accidental. It was the result of decades spent building discipline under pressure, enduring rejection without bitterness and refusing to reshape herself to match expectation. At a moment when the industry assumed her relevance was narrowing, Dench's presence expanded. She did not chase youth. She confronted time hidden and made it yield. That defiance reached its sharpest expression when she won an Academy Award with only minutes of screen time. The performance did not rely on transformation or spectacle. It relied on control. Each word carried weight, and each silence implied history. What audiences witnessed was not a veteran clinging to relevance, but a woman distilling everything she had learned into something devastatingly precise. Yet, even as her professional life entered this extraordinary late chapter, forces beyond the stage were already moving quietly against her. Long before the world began speaking about her farewell, Judi Dench was facing losses that no role, no acclaim, and no applause could soften. The night memory burned. In the early 1990s, Judi Dench was still climbing. Her career was widening, her confidence steady, her personal life anchored by routine and familiarity. Then, without warning, a single night dismantled the private structure she had spent decades building. A fire broke out in her Hampstead home, the place where her life with her husband, Michael Williams, and their daughter had been quietly preserved in paper, fabric, and habit. By the time the flames were extinguished, almost everything inside was gone. What the fire destroyed was not luxury. It erased memory. Scripts covered in handwritten notes from early productions were reduced to ash. Letters folded and refolded across years of marriage vanished. Photographs softened by time and touch were lost forever. Most painful of all were the albums Michael had kept without ceremony or display. Every Friday of their marriage he had given her a single rose. He pressed each one, stored them carefully, marking time not with anniversaries, but with consistency. Those roses did not survive the fire. Dench later spoke about the loss without drama, but the meaning was unmistakable. The house had not been a symbol of success. It had been a record of life. When it burned, it felt as though time itself had been erased. Rebuilding the walls was possible. Rebuilding what had lived inside them was not. She was forced to confront the idea that even the most carefully guarded past could vanish overnight. To the outside world, she remained composed. She went back to work. She spoke politely about recovery. What few understood was how deeply the loss had altered her relationship with memory. After the fire, she became acutely aware that what remained of her life existed largely in the present moment. Objects could not be trusted to hold history. Only people could. That awareness sharpened her performances. Audiences noticed something different in her work during the years that followed, though few could articulate it. Her pauses felt heavier. Her silences carried absence. It was not a stylistic shift. It was the weight of someone who had learned how quickly everything familiar could disappear. The fire did not end her ascent. But it changed its tone. It stripped away comfort and replaced it with urgency. And while Dench rebuilt her home, she could not rebuild the illusion that life was stable. That illusion was gone for good. What remained was endurance, and endurance would soon be tested again, far more cruelly, not by flames, but by grief, when the roses stopped. For more than 3 decades, Judi Dench's life had been quietly measured not in premieres or reviews, but in a ritual so small it barely registered to the outside world. Every Friday, without fail, her husband, Michael Williams, placed a single red rose in her hand. No occasion was needed. No audience was required. It was simply how their marriage breathed. Week after week, year after year, the gesture repeated itself until it became structure, not romance, but certainty. Michael was more than her partner in life. He was her anchor. A respected actor in his own right, he understood the silences behind performance and the cost of public endurance. Their home was filled with shared laughter, shared work, and the quiet confidence of two people who did not need to prove anything to anyone. Their daughter grew up inside that steadiness. Fame moved around them, but it never replaced the center. That center collapsed when Michael was diagnosed with lung cancer. The illness advanced quickly, stripping him of breath and strength with brutal efficiency. Dench was working abroad when the urgency became undeniable. Flights were delayed. Hours passed in helpless suspension. She later described that waiting as the most terrifying experience of her life, knowing that time was slipping away while she was powerless to reach him. She did make it back. She was with him at the end. When Michael died, the Friday roses stopped. The rhythm that had quietly carried her through decades vanished overnight. To the public, she remained Dame Judi Dench, composed and professional. To herself, she was suddenly a widow, standing in rooms that no longer felt anchored. Grief did not pause her career. She returned to work almost immediately, not out of strength, but necessity. Acting became survival. Lines spoken on set were something solid to hold on to when everything else felt unsteady. In later interviews, she admitted that if she had stopped, she would have fallen apart entirely. The change was visible in her work, though rarely named. Performances from this period carried a deeper ache. Characters grieving did not feel imagined. They felt lived. Audiences responded instinctively, sensing authenticity without understanding its source. What they were witnessing was not technique. It was loss being carried forward. Dench never remarried. She never attempted to replace Michael. When asked why, her answer was simple. He was still present in memory, in habit, in the way silence moved through her home. Love, she seemed to suggest, does not end when life does. It simply changes form. Yet, even as she learned to live with absence, another force was quietly approaching, one that would not take a person, but something even more essential to her identity. And unlike grief, it would not fade with time. When the words began to disappear, in 2012, Judi Dench sat across from doctors and heard a diagnosis that landed with a quiet finality she could not ignore. Age-related macular degeneration. One eye affected in one way, the other in another. For many people, it meant inconvenience. For Dench, it threatened the very foundation of her life. Her art had always begun with words on a page. She read slowly, precisely, returning to lines again and again until meaning revealed itself. Now those words were dissolving. At first, she spoke about it with restraint. She insisted she could manage. She reminded interviewers that many people lived full lives with the condition. But the progression was relentless. Letters blurred, sentences fractured, pages became fields of fog. The simple private pleasure of sitting alone with a script vanished. What had once been instinctive now required assistance. Friends began reading scripts aloud to her. Colleagues repeated lines until they lodged in memory. On set, cues were whispered. Movements were guided to the audience. Nothing appeared broken. Performances remained controlled, intelligent, deeply felt. What they did not see was the effort behind each moment. Acting had become an act of resistance. Dench was candid about the humiliation of losing independence. She admitted she could no longer go out alone without fear of walking into objects or falling. She could not drive. She could not read. She could not recognize faces clearly, relying instead on outlines and voices she knew by heart. In interviews, she stated the truth plainly without ornament. She could not see, and still she refused to stop. She memorized lines like poems. She leaned on rhythm when vision failed. She adapted, not because it was easy, but because surrender felt worse. For years, the public mistook this endurance for invincibility. In reality, each project demanded more from her than the last. Physical challenges followed. Pain in her knees required surgery and replacement. She learned to walk again, step by step. Unlike her eyesight, her body could recover. That contrast was cruelly instructive. Bones could heal. Sight would not return. By the mid-2000s, denial was no longer possible. She admitted openly that her vision was almost gone. Hearing too began to fade. The senses that had carried her brilliance for decades were retreating one by one. For someone whose life had been built on awareness, on presence, the loss was devastating. Yet what defined this period was not collapse, but honesty. Dench did not disguise her limitations or retreat into silence. She named them. And in doing so, she revealed a truth far more unsettling than any diagnosis. Even greatness has a cost. And sometimes that cost is paid slowly, line by line, until the page itself disappears. Living without the light. As her eyesight continued to fade, Judi Dench's life narrowed in ways no award or reputation could protect her from. Independence, something she had never questioned before, became fragile. She spoke openly about the fear of moving through familiar spaces, about bumping into furniture, about the quiet humiliation of needing assistance for tasks she once performed without thought. This was not a dramatic collapse. It was a slow daily erosion. Public appearances became rare and carefully managed. When she did step into the world, the contrast was painful. Cameras still flashed. Voices still called her name. Yet, the woman they addressed could no longer see the faces speaking to her. At events, she relied on touch, on voices she recognized, on companions who guided her through moments that once belonged entirely to her. In one particularly unsettling public appearance, she was heard quietly explaining that she could not see at all, even as photographers continued to shout instructions. The moment unsettled audiences, not because of cruelty alone, but because it exposed how little the machinery of fame adapts to human decline. At home, life shifted toward smaller, quieter anchors. Her daughter remained close, not as a caretaker, but as a constant presence. Her grandson brought something no audience ever could: continuity. In his laughter, Dench sometimes recognized echoes of Michael, sounds that collapsed time and softened grief for brief moments. These were not performances. They were lifelines. She found companionship again, not as replacement, but as comfort. David Mills entered her life gently, sharing meals, conversations, and long swims. He did not erase the past. He helped her inhabit the present. Love, she seemed to accept, could exist without comparison, without competition. Nature became another refuge. Dench had always loved trees. But in these years that love deepened into ritual, she planted trees in memory of friends she had lost, creating a private woodland where each trunk carried a name, a face without second.